Hi, well, I'm on a series on Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, and it occurred to me that since I'm writing a book that uses classical conservatism as one of its theory strains, that maybe I ought to read a little selection from the introduction to that book as a part of this series. The book won't be finished for probably another year and a half, and I am in the midst of finding a good publisher for it, and I have a good lead, and I can't say who it is until I know for sure that I'm under contract, but I think it's an appropriate publisher and I'm hoping for the best. So in this book, I'm going to draw from theory streams, including classical conservatism, Marxian thought, psychological theory or political psychology, and political theology. And so this section that I'm going to read you is describing in the introduction the classical conservative theory stream that is inspired by Edmund Burke. This book is going to be for a popular as well as a scholarly audience, and I'm going to make sure that it's priced at a reasonable price, unlike so many academic books, so people can actually buy it if they want to. Yay! All right, so here goes. I was first exposed to classical conservatism when I took a class on Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France in graduate school. The fact that we devoted an entire semester to that single 18th century work gave me time to contemplate the significant difference between Burke's conservatism and the conservatism popular in the US from the 1980s onward. Learning how Burke viewed the classical liberalism of the American and French revolutions was my first glimpse into a practical way of thinking that I have continued to find compelling. The first thing to keep in mind is that American and French revolutions were radical events. They were not celebrations of tradition. From Burke's perspective, the French Revolution in particular contained strong currents of extremism. Both revolutions represented profound breaks with past institutions and traditional sources of authority. In his view, they promoted experimental, materialistic, often anti-religious ways of thinking and living. These liberal revolutions represented some values that Burke found compelling, such as human equality and freedom, but also many values that he found highly objectionable. One idea to which he strongly objected was the liberal primacy of individual self-interest as a one-size-fits-all motivation for action in the marketplace and in politics. The damage to religious faith caused by radical Enlightenment thinking gave Burke even more cause for concern. He thought that people benefited spiritually, but also socially from the guiding thread of a living religion in their lives. Burke thought that the benefits of religion included personal and social stability, concern for others, a sense of duty and responsibility, and the humbling knowledge that there is something in life greater than oneself. Burke seemed to think that if we could only embrace the humility inherent in faith in a higher power, we could be spared a lot of self-inflicted grief. Classical conservatism is the way of thinking more than it is an ideology. It is wary of social change. It does not, however, defend standing still or going backwards towards some supposedly ideal, better time. During and after the French Revolution, reactionaries wanted to return to absolute monarchy. Burke, however, wanted to adapt the English Constitution to the popular, more democratic currents of his time without losing the cultural unity and stability the English monarchy provided. This is why Burke was particularly horrified when the French first deposed and then killed their king. When we decide that we know without a doubt what is best in every instance, when we call all previous ways of living foolish, when we propose to change everything suddenly to something much more rational, the Burkean conservative senses that we are, like Icarus in the famous Greek myth, about to get burned. If a society has managed to survive for centuries with a monarch, for instance, then we ought to ask with some humility, what functions did that monarch serve? Burke, somewhat like Confucius, noted that many long-standing purposes of cultural and governmental institutions were reasonable, but people had forgotten the reasons. Instead of being thrown out, The reasons behind the institutions need to be recovered so that we can make wise decisions about what to keep and what to change. To continue with this example, there are many reasons for wanting to abolish monarchy. Monarchies perpetuate inequality, and we have decided that we want less of that because ordinary people do not want to be serfs. Monarchies serve to keep wealth concentrated, and we no longer approve of oligarchy, but monarchies also serve to unify people around a meaningful cultural symbol. Because they can unify people, monarchies may sometimes allow citizens to give more time to their family, community, and livelihoods, and spend less of their time on futile political battles. Maybe monarchies also create a situation in which leaders want to appear morally upright because they know that their behavior is under scrutiny and sets the tone for an entire nation. If we completely eliminate monarchy like the French and before them the English, then both the bad and the beneficial effects of having a monarchy are suddenly erased. As a matter of fact, in the subsequent man-made cultural vacuum, we might inadvertently create a situation where a worse type of leader steps in. To conclude the example, now perhaps the fact that the British have retained their monarchy as a relatively benign cultural institution makes some sense. During the 1980s and 90s, US conservatives proposed some fairly drastic changes to reverse the similarly monumental New Deal changes the US had gone through as a result of the Great Depression and World War II. Republicans initiated a second culture-shattering shift in one century. Not only did they want to reverse the welfare state, but they wanted to rush forward into a rationalistic free market way of doing business that optimistically claimed that market incentives could cure all human problems, including racism, poverty, and environmental pollution. Here is an example of how sudden change that purports to be rational can backfire. In the political arena, right liberals or conservatives in US parlance, right liberals argued that all the regulations on political donations adopted in the 1970s in the wake of the Watergate scandal ought to be removed. Their response to critics who were afraid that this would make corporate political influence too strong in our politics sounded promisingly rational. First, Republicans argued that the private marketplace of donations would increase the diversity of donations and reduce the influence of any one donor. Second, they argued that with full transparency about who gave what, each voter could freely decide whether the donations that candidates received mattered. In the free marketplace of donations, if a voter didn't like where the candidate's funds came from, she could just vote for another candidate, or so the reasoning went. That idealistic argument for a free marketplace of donations and information would work if all voters were highly and accurately informed, rational actors who spent a good part of their day reading up on campaign financing and what their representatives and candidates were doing. Enlightenment liberal thinking tends to assume such rational actors, a way of thinking known as rationalism. But as we know, most voters, just like most buyers, are not that highly informed or consistently rational. They're too busy making a living and taking care of their families to be extremely well informed. The result is that corporate and wealthy donors, especially since Citizens United versus the FEC in 2010, have gained much more clout in our electoral system. The subsequent influence of big money on our political process has helped create the open corruption now fondly referred to by today's Republicans as the swamp. Edmund Burke did not think that human beings were the rational maximizers so crucial to classical liberal theory. Because of this, Burkean classical conservatism would be skeptical of the Milton Friedman style conservatism of today that holds sway among so many of today's right liberal champions of capitalism. I'm going to call today's US conservatives right liberals from now on, so just keep that in mind. Right liberals tend to argue in an illiberal direction on social issues such as abortion, gay marriage, affirmative action, and drug legalization. They can see that society is changing rapidly and that the older ideals of the heterosexual family, monogamous marriage for life, Anglo-Saxon dominance of the US culture and economy, and traditional relationships among men, women, youth, and elders are waning. They sound a bit like classical conservatives in their complaints about these changes, and there is some similarity in their way of thinking, but only so much. Republicans want to idealize the family, to campaign for what has never been fully realized, and to somehow turn back the clock to a more wholesome era. In this respect, today's Republicans are more like 18th and 19th century reactionaries, and they have the same chance of reversing social change as their precursors. And like the previous reactionaries, the fact that they complain about social and cultural disruptions does not mean that they understand why these disruptions are happening. I will argue that liberal free market capitalism has created the very conditions in which all sorts of traditional institutions, values, and ways of life are upended for better or worse. As Charles Taylor sees it, quote, in their economic policies, they advocate an untamed form of capitalist enterprise, which more than anything else has helped to dissolve historical communities, has fostered atomism, which knows no frontiers or loyalties and is ready to close down a mining town or savage a forest habitat at the drop of a balance sheet. Right liberalism is a form of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is built around the individual as the main political actor. The individual's rights are all important. According to classical liberal ideology, the economy thrives to the extent that individuals act upon their self-interest in the workplace, business, and in consuming products and services. The right liberal economic imaginary is based squarely on individual choice. But the reality is that continual growth can only be attained with ever-increasing stimulation of individual desires through marketing. Why wouldn't consumers, who are told that their individual rights and self-defined interests are paramount, and that American freedom equals ever-increasing abundance to abundant goods at low prices, also want to break loose from society's hidebound moral rules, particularly any restrictive ideas of what they as individuals or their families ought to like or ought to be like? Economic and cultural liberation are not only coincidental, but mutually causal and reinforcing. Having ever-increasing choice and change in products to consume raises expectations in other areas of life for more variety and change, making traditional lasting relationships seem particularly boring and stultifying. The breakup of relationships and families and the loosening of social bonds certainly put people into a position of needing more goods and services in their relative social isolation and personal independence. These observations, succinctly summed up by dating apps where people shop for their next mate, validate Burke's classical conservative warning of unintended consequences coming from seemingly rational policies. In this case, the unintended consequences have destabilized families, communities, and cultures in the US and around the world. The intended consequences of capitalism were too materialistic, and the relentless pursuit of mammon in our society, which leaves all frayed and empty, is the unhappy result. Burke disdained people who thought of making money more than they thought of their familial or social duties. But now we tend to disrespect people who choose to stay in their hometown out of an obligation to their family if it gets in the way of their career. In our contemporary cultural framework, it is too much to ask of the autonomous individual to forego greater financial success and status. As Burke predicted, a claim to rights without equal or greater acceptance of one's duties creates a selfish and rapacious society that is inhospitable to strong families and communities. The cultural unintended consequences of the free market ideology, including increasing acceptance of previous taboos, such as gay marriage, acceptance of transsexual rights, and before those, equality for minorities and women, may be better results than the material abundance we find in the midst of poverty and alienation. Most of today's right liberals would disagree with that observation. But whether all these changes are good or not, they continue to be connected to economic developments that right liberals support. Here's an example that may help illustrate the connection. During and after World War II, women moved into the workforce, something that is usually celebrated as a move towards equality. Women's entrance into the labor market grew the economy by bringing more money into circulation and expanding the consumer base. It also stimulated growth by lowering overall compensation to the point where, to live a middle-class lifestyle, both spouses in a traditional marriage would have to work. This is perhaps not the best use of either partner's time, and it meant that children and elderly would increasingly be in daycare centers and assisted living facilities, but at least women were now more accepted as equals in our society. Women in the workplace closing in on complete social and economic equality is an example of how capitalism makes social distinctions that once felt unchangeable become obsolete and retrograde. The resulting changes feel liberating, and to that extent, capitalism has been beneficial for women. However, the liberation afforded by this commercial inevitability only goes so far, and arguably does not free women, in this example, in their full humanity, but only as workers, consumers, and subjects of contracts. Rights movements are good but imperfect. They are good because they bring a certain type of emancipation for a lot of people. They are imperfect because so often they begin and end with the demand to engage in the same type of self-interested liberal activities that their previous oppressors have engaged in, creating a lot of conflict and waste along the way. Realistically, acceptance of the individual's chosen way of life as a right is perhaps the first step towards full acceptance of all human beings as equal children of God. As such, acceptance of fully equal rights perhaps points us in the direction of a fuller and more fully human community. A classical conservative response to these types of cultural developments, when they have become culturally mainstream, is acceptance, but also a realistic acknowledgement that legal equality is not a miracle fix for all that ails humanity. Instead, the classical conservative would see these types of changes as necessary adaptations to the cultural environment. Classical conservatism has a concept, the social fabric, which argues that all human beings are woven together, including the dead, their legacy, the living, and those yet to be born. If one person pulls off in the direction of their self-interested and purely individual rights, so will others, fraying the social fabric. Once that fabric is damaged, it is very difficult to repair and leads to confusion, conflict, and decline. If the social fabric is not to be frayed, we have to have enough societal cohesion based on mutual self-control, regard, and care so that people do not feel like pulling so far away. In our current context, the uncompromising anti-mask protester and pro-choice activists share a mutual desire to pull away, to not be encumbered by anyone else's concerns, cares, wishes, or desires, a mutual desire for complete bodily autonomy. We must acknowledge that the impact of a pregnancy on a woman's body and life is by far the greater than the impact of a face mask. The larger point, though, is that with the insistence of complete autonomy, as Burke alluded, comes a brittle vulnerability stemming from a lack of true supportive community. Classical conservatives value flesh and blood people above ideas. They do not advocate pushing people to change beyond their current capabilities. But that's not the same as saying that they should not be pushed to change at all. Burke was a member of the Whig Party in England, and as such, he was an advocate for the change that happened during England's Glorious Revolution. That event moved England away from absolute monarchy to parliamentary supremacy. Burke saw these changes, including increasing political and legal rights and slowly expanding franchise, as evolutionary moves to fulfill the potential inherent in the English Constitution. But he knew these changes were possible because the social and commercial development of the English people at his time had laid the groundwork for them. What Burke opposed, and what he saw happen during the French Revolution, was people forcibly imposing abstract and radically different ideas on a population that wasn't ready for them. When a minority of people in a society have a grand scheme for change and are willing to use force if necessary to get that scheme accomplished, They are acting as extremists, hurting people to help them. As Rousseau famously stated, they are forcing people to be free. To avoid the harm that comes with sudden drastic change, Burke advocated for incrementalism. Instead of imposing a one-size-fits-all blueprint, classical conservatives take a small-scale experimental model for change. If a smaller change doesn't work, it is to be examined and changed again. There should always be an exit strategy, a way of moving back to a position that works better. This way of dealing with necessary change comes from a place of humility rather than a typical "we've got the one right answer" mentality. In addition, the classical conservative way of thinking rejects universalism when it comes to change. It's willing to admit that what works in one place or time may not work in another because the conditions are different and or the people are different. This need not indicate moral relativism. It is an acknowledgement of the reality on the ground, and also the fact that there are multiple but not infinite ways to obtain beneficial results, all of which may prove their utility in the places they're tried. In the US, we are now seeing the effects of a radical, universalistic, one-answer mode of thinking. Free market liberalism insists that marketplace thinking works equally well for all people in all times and places, and even works best to organize people and solve problems in areas previously deemed beyond the market, such as schools, churches, family, and community life. In this way, it shares some of the totalitarian aspects of more openly apocalyptic revolutionary regimes. We see liberalism in the insistence that farmers need to get big or get out. And if this is no longer economically feasible to run their family and farm and pass it down to their kids, they should simply retool and join another sector of the economy. We see it also in houses of worship that engage in marketing strategies to raise funds in their capital campaigns and engage Madison Avenue advertising techniques to attract participants. We see it in education when parents and teachers alike generally agree that studying history, reading literature, and making art and music waste students' time because they aren't immediately lucrative. Right liberals in the US complain about the decline in active and informed citizenship and aesthetic tastes without understanding the connection between cultural decline and the imperative to study just for employment. Do today's Republicans really want to support an ideology whose worst consequences are the dissolution of community, culture, family, and citizenship? Do they really want to identify individual rights with consumer freedom? Does religious piety really go along well with an ardent faith in the power of a certain type of economy and politics to solve all problems? Do the laws they support, which attempt to curb or turn back cultural change, really go along with the capitalism they support, whose imperative is unbridled growth? This book will take an unflinching stance on the contradictions inherent in the current right liberal positions and try to argue for their correction. So there you have it.